Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about inventory. This is part of our Back to Basics series, where we're going and looking at some of the basics of Flex to help some of our newer customers, or if you're maybe a new employee at a company that uses Flex, to kind of help you get on board with some of the basics that you can find in Flex. So today we're going to be looking at inventory. We're going to cover a few things here. We're going to look at the inventory tree, how that's organized and what that means for quote building and things like that. We're going to be looking at how to add inventory, both inventory models and serial units, and we'll look at the different types of inventory you can set up, including serialized models and non-serialized models. And then we'll, along the way, just look at some best practices as we go. So let's start just by explaining what you see in the Flex user interface when you're over here on the left-hand side. This is what we call our resource browser. All of these different things over here are resources that you use in Flex, like your contacts, facilities, inventory, services. Today we're focusing on inventory, of course, and our inventory is organized into what we call an inventory tree. This consists of parent and child groups. And technically you can go as deep as you need to with these child groups, but as a good rule of thumb, we usually try to recommend not going any more than maybe 3 or so deep. Just because when you're building a quote, a lot of times you'll be using this browse functionality of the inventory tree to find your inventory models and drag and drop them onto a quote. And if you have to click through 5 different layers or levels of groups, it might become somewhat cumbersome as you're building your quotes. So we usually recommend going about 3 deep. Similarly, if you have a group that has more items than can fit on your visible, the height of your inventory tree, then we recommend maybe thinking about splitting those items up as well into 2 separate groups so that you don't have to scroll through just to view the contents of a single group. For those of you who might be new to Flex, you might notice that your inventory tree has just one group. I forget exactly what it's called, but it basically is just a placeholder group that has to be there because the way that you create new groups is by right-clicking on an existing group, then going to Inventory Group Manager, and from there you can add a new child group or an entirely new inventory group. So if I click New Inventory Group, we'll just call it New Group. Here I can give it an icon, choose from any icon in my library here, then click Create, and that new group will appear over here in my tree. And then from here I can drag and drop that group to wherever I want. So say, for example, I want it to appear below Power. So I would drop it onto the Power group, and then Flex gives me the option to move it inside of the Power group, above or below. And I want to move it below. And so if you, like I said, if you are a new customer and you're not doing an inventory import and you're just creating your inventory from scratch, after you create that first group, you can delete the default group. But just make sure that you have another group created before you delete that, because if you delete all your groups, then you don't have a way to add new groups, and Flex support will have to help you get out of that. Let's just briefly look at creating a child group too. Pretty self-explanatory. We just go back to our right-click menu, click Inventory Group Manager, and then say New Child Group. And like I said, there's really no limit to how many child groups you can add to a parent group. And let's say that there's a group somewhere that I want to move from one group to another. I could just drag and drop, place it on top of the group I want to move it into, and say Move Inside. So that's how you can manage your inventory tree. Once you have your tree created, and again, this is all assuming that you didn't take advantage of Flex's inventory import, Because if you do an inventory import, then you should have put in your groups and inventory folders in that inventory import sheet, and those would automatically be created for you. But if you're not doing an inventory import, or if somewhere down the road you're just creating some new groups, then that's how you can do that. A few other cool things you can do with your inventory groups. Let's say that I want to quickly view the availability of all the items inside a specific group. I could right-click the group, then click Inventory Group Availability, and that's going to show me all the items that are directly inside of that group with their schedule based on whatever date range I enter here. So keep in mind that only works if there are items directly inside of the group. So when I right-click Powered, I have 5 items in there, so it shows me those 5 items. If I try to do that same thing from the Speakers group, it's not going to show anything because there aren't any inventory items directly inside of that group. And then, of course, if you need to make changes to any of your inventory groups, you could right-click, click Inventory Group Manager, and click Edit Inventory Group. That's where you can change the name, the icon. You can even choose which security groups are eligible to view this group. So the second I click one of these, then only the group that I checked will be able to view this. But if I leave them all blank, then anybody can view it. You can also assign a specific management group. And then this is kind of a deeper feature that we aren't going to get into today, but that just gives you some basic information about this group and some of the editable fields. Of course, once you have your inventory tree created, then you can start adding and moving your inventory into those groups. The fastest and easiest way to do that, and the preferred method that I like using, is to find the group that you want to add something into. So let's say cameras, right-click on that group, and then click New Inventory Item. The reason I like doing it this way is because now the primary group field for your new inventory item is auto-filled in with whatever group you right-clicked on. The other way you can do it is click on the inventory menu, and there's an option called New Inventory Item. And it does almost the same thing, except primary group doesn't automatically get filled in. So you'd have to click the pencil icon, select the group, and then click Accept. But like I said, I like doing it with the right click on the group because it auto fills in that primary group. It just kind of takes one less step. Let's go through all these different fields of an inventory model as we're creating a new one and explain what each of them mean. The item name, you probably want that to be more of a full name. This is the name that will appear on quotes. So when you're building quotes, this is going to be the entire name that a customer might see on their quote. So you might put a model number in here, and I don't really know Sony model numbers, so I'll just make one up. Full description of what this item is so that when it appears on a quote, your customers can see what that full description is. The short name's a little bit different. The short name is what will appear over here in the tree. So you might make that something just a little bit shorter, something that your employees will know. Because if I put just that on a quote, a customer might be, well, I have no idea what that is. They would want to see the full HD camera name. But to your employees, to your warehouse, or to the people who are building quotes, they might just need to see this over in the inventory tree to be able to build this and put this on a quote or a pull sheet. Shorthand is also just another shortened version of the name. Maybe I just put something like Sony HD. And what this does is it makes this keyword searchable. So if I were to go over to my search tab here and use this as my search term, then it would pull up this inventory item in my search. That's kind of a carryover from older inventory management programs where you would primarily build your quotes by searching a shorthand. So a lot of people are used to that, so we included it in Flex so that you can use it here. Narrative description is just a longer description of this item if you want to put it in there. It's not required. In fact, most of these fields aren't required except for a name. You need a primary group. and a preset. Everything else is optional, but I always recommend filling in as much as you can, because as much as you put into Flex, you can get a lot of information out of Flex in the form of reports and things like that. So for example, one that I always like to reference is like a manifest report. If I put this item on a manifest, I might want to know certain information. And I should clarify, I don't put this on a manifest. If I scan this item out to a job and this item goes onto a manifest, then I might want certain information about everything on my manifest, because the manifest is everything that I'm shipping. So maybe I want to print out a manifest that shows the manufacturer info of all of my inventory. Maybe the sizes. In this one, I don't really know if I would put a size. This size field is maybe more for cable lengths or TV sizes. I don't think I would really put a size into the HD camera field. But there are other things like a replacement or purchase cost. Country of manufacture is a big one. A lot of times on a manifest, if you're crossing borders, you might need that country of manufacture information. And also the weights and measurements. So let's say this is a 20-pound camera. I put this camera, some speakers, some lighting equipment, power cable. If all of those have weights entered, then I can print a manifest that shows the total weight of everything that I scanned. So that's a really useful way to be able to see the full weight of everything you're putting onto a truck. So again, as much as you put in here, you can get that out of Flex. Again, I'm not really a video guy. I'm just going to make up some numbers for purchase and replacement costs. These could be the same number. They might be different. That's just up to you and what you actually purchased or what the replacement cost might be. And again, you can print different reports that will show things like, what is the entire replacement cost of everything I scanned out to a job? So it's good to have that information there. You can also put items into additional groups. This is just going to be the primary group over here that it appears in. But I could put this into a separate group that will appear in the inventory tree. It's the same exact item, it just might appear somewhere else in the tree. Here I can add an icon. We have a pretty vast icon library. You can also add icons. If you go to your system settings menu, there's an icon library you can add things to, but we have most icons that you might be looking for. Again, not sure where that's manufactured. It might be Japan or somewhere, I'm not sure, but you could put that information there. You also have the option to hide this item from the inventory tree. There's a permission in Flex that says, can you view and search for hidden items, yes or no? So if I have a hidden item, and if somebody logs in that has that permission denied to view and search for hidden items, they wouldn't be able to see this item in the inventory tree. I'll show you why you might do this with a couple examples once we're done creating this item, but for the most part, you probably won't hide your inventory, but I'll show you some examples of why you might. We also have the option to line mute this item by default. What line muting means is when I add this item to a quote, there's a checkbox on the quote that says whether or not you want to line mute the item. And that means when you print a PDF, do you want that item to show up on the PDF? Because sometimes, especially if you have a large package or something like that, you might line mute all the contents of the package to not print on the PDF, because all your customer needs to see is a single line item that says something like video camera package. But they don't need to see the specific camera or the cabling or the tripod stand and all of that. So you might line mute by default some of those items so the customer never really has to see them, but they still get included in the total of the quote. And they'll still appear on pull sheets and things like that. So when you get to the point of having to pull this from your warehouse, you'll still see the item. This really just has to do with whether or not the customer sees the item. I'm going to say line mute by default no. And I'll come back to the structure and availability. I just want to cover some of these other fields really quick, and then we'll get back to that. You could choose whether or not the item's expendable. If you choose yes, then the item, whenever you put it on a quote, will default to whatever the expendable type is, which by default is the retail. Most items, since Flex is a rental management software, most items you put on a quote will be rental items, but you might have some items that are expendable you don't necessarily expect to come back, that you might charge as a retail item, a retail price to your customer. So this would just designate whether or not it's one of those type of items. And then you also have some tracking information that you can put in there just for a reference. The barcode, however, you want to leave this blank because this is going to create a reference barcode in the system for this inventory model. That isn't necessarily going to be the barcode that you put onto each camera or each item. This is going to be what we call the inventory model barcode. Depending on what type of item we set up, we may or may not ever use this barcode, but Flex will create one for us anyway, just as a reference. We already looked at the logistics info you can put in here. And you can also put in some default notes. So when you drag and drop this item on a quote, the notes field for that line item on a quote would automatically populate whatever you put in here. And again, note muting would say, do I want that note to appear on a PDF? Yes or no. So if this is more of an internal note, you might say note mute it because I never want customers to see it. But maybe this note is more instructional information. So you might put in some notes about how to set up camera with a step-by-step. And then you wouldn't note mute it in that case. So again, fill in as many of these fields as you can. Otherwise, if you want to get a lot more out of Flex, you would have to go back and start editing all your inventory that you already created. So I always recommend putting in as much as you can right from the get-go. Finally, let's kind of look at the structure and availability settings. We'll talk about what all of these mean. We're not going to get into detail about some of the virtual and package type items, but we do want to fully explain what a non-serialized model is versus a serialized model. So a non-serialized model is going to be something that might deal with just generic quantities. Examples of this might be like cabling. So if I have VGA cable, I don't necessarily want to put a unique barcode on each and every cable to scan those out. When I scan cable out of my system, I might just want to enter one reference barcode, which would be what Flex automatically creates here, and then just type in a quantity. I'm scanning out 50 cables, and then Flex scans out 50 cables, and you're done. That's what a non-serialized model will do. More generic quantities, and you're not individually barcoding each and every unit. Now, I'm creating an inventory model for this camera. I would probably want to set this one up as a serialized model, which means that each unit is tracked by serial number, which means that each individual unit that I own of these cameras will have its own barcode. So that's the main difference between the two major types of inventory models you could set up. Serialized model means that each unit you own will have its own unique barcode. Non-serialized model just means that you might own a certain quantity of those, but each unit doesn't get its own barcode, and when you scan them out, you're not scanning individual barcodes on each unit, you're just scanning a single barcode, then entering whatever quantity. Once we're done creating this, I'll show you some examples of non-serialized models in my system, but I want to create this camera as a serialized model. Keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily mean that the units have to have serial numbers. For example, I do know some companies that will serialize even some smaller items like DI boxes or cables, and those definitely don't have serial numbers on them. But you could still set them up as a serialized model if you want each one to have their own barcode. So that's a common misconception. Just because it's called serialized model, that doesn't mean that the units have to have serial numbers. Some of these other settings we'll go over in probably next week. We'll talk more about packages, containers, and things like that. But for now, I'll just show you a few of these settings and give you a brief overview of what they mean. So for example, like a serialized package or serialized storage item, if you set up an item like that, that means that the item is actually some sort of case or container that you can scan items into. That's one of the great features about Flex, is that if you have a case or a container item, you can actually scan other things into it, so that when you're prepping a job, all you have to do is scan the single barcode on the outside of a case, and everything inside of it will automatically scan out with it. So if I were setting up like a Sony camera case, or like a Pelican, or whatever kind of case this camera comes in, I might set that up as a serialized package or a serialized storage container type item. So again, we'll look at all those in another webinar, but you'll notice that as you choose those, all these presets start changing. The flags will go from no to yes, but we'll go ahead and explain all that in another webinar. For now though, you can click the preset configuration definitions, and that will give you a little bit more information, but we'll talk about it in another webinar. So I think we're ready. I want to change this to no. I forgot to switch that back. Expendable is no. I think we're ready to create this item and add it to our system. So I'll click Add. Notice over here it's in the inventory tree under Cameras now. And then here's the full view of this new inventory model that I just created. I can click here and upload a model image using a webcam or taking a saved picture from our desktop, and then just go through the steps to upload a model image there. I could always go in and edit the inventory item by clicking up here. Brings me to that same screen we were just on. I can make changes to anything. Delete the item from here, copy this inventory item where it takes most of the same information that I input. I could view schedules, and there's a few other options here that we'll look at in later webinars as well. But a lot of different options for me to manage my inventory model here. You'll also notice, because I set this item up as a serialized inventory model, look at my quantities. I can't just click in here. There's no button for me to just change quantities. The way that I increase quantities is by going to my serial numbers tab, and then using this strip along here to add each unit. So let's say I have a camera, serial number is this. I'm not going to put in a barcode. Again, Flex will automatically create a barcode for this unit if I leave it blank. If I have a stencil, this might be some sort of writing or identification of this unit on the outside of the unit. I might put a stencil there. If this is a certain model, I might put that information in there as well. Make sure you have the correct location that you're putting the inventory into. If you have multiple locations, just make sure you're selected on the right one. And then your resource type. Is this an item that you're going to be renting? Is it a retail item that you're going to be selling? 99.9% of the time you're going to choose between those two. And I would imagine that most of you, if you're using Flex's rental management, which is what it's built for, that 98% of the time you're going to add items as rental. Could also add specific purchase date information for this unit. Purchase order number. The purchase cost, if I click into it, will automatically fill in with whatever I put in the model information. But I could change that if I maybe purchase this one for a little bit more. And once I have all that information, I just click Add. And now there's that barcode. I could open this barcode, print it, put that barcode onto this camera unit, and then it's ready to be scanned in and out of my system. And notice too, the quantity has gone up. I have 1 out of 1 in my Salt Lake City warehouse now. And once I start scanning this in and out, this first number would go up and down based on how many I currently have available. And the second number just means how many I own in total. Now this is different with serialized items. For example, VGA cable. And I think I misspoke. I meant this is different with non-serialized items, where notice I set this item up as a non-serialized model. And I don't have a serial numbers tab. The way that I enter quantities is just by going down here, clicking change quantities, and then I enter how many I currently have on hand, then how many are allocated to that warehouse, or how many you own in that warehouse. And again, once you put those initial numbers in, that first number will go up and down as you scan these items out and in. And you might only change the second number as you purchase more or inherit more or something like that. So that's the big difference between serialized and non-serialized. Now I get this question a lot. What is the rule of thumb for setting up a serialized versus non-serialized item? And I always give a similar answer, and that is, that's up to you. But a few suggestions that I do give would be something like, think about the trackability between these two items. If I send out 50 of these VGA cables, 10 to one job, 20 to another job, 5 to another job, 10 to another job, and then I get all of those back at the same time, and they're just sitting in one big pile in my warehouse, what if I'm missing 3 cables? I'm not really sure which job those 3 are missing from, since everything just came back and is sitting in one giant pile. Whereas with my cameras, I could send out 5 of these, 2 to one job, 1 to another job, 1 to another job, and another one to another job. Because I'm scanning out specific barcodes for each camera, and when I scan that barcode out, it will show me what job it got scanned out to. If one goes missing, I could just really easily look at my serial numbers here and see the current location of each and every one. So I can see, oh, it looks like it never got scanned back from this job, and you'll know exactly where to start looking. So that's one thing that I always mention, just how much do you want to be able to track your inventory, and that's a good decision as to whether or not you might set it up as serialized or non-serialized. And then another thing that I always have people think about is what kind of manpower do you have in your warehouse to be able to scan these items in and out? Because if you do set up everything as serialized, you're going to have to scan out each and every unit. What I mean by that is, what if these VGA cables were set up as serialized, where each of my 67 cables had its own unique barcode? To scan those out the door, I would have to scan each and every cable. And I know some of our customers do that. I came from a warehouse that did that, where we scanned every cable. And to us, it was worth it because we were sending out so many, and we would lose so many that it was very much worth it to us to be able to know which job was responsible for the missing cables. So when we'd scan everything back, we could just easily run a report that showed everything that's missing and which job was responsible for it. But we also had the luxury and the benefit of having a full-time, at least dozen or up to 20 people warehouse staff that had the time to do that. But I realize that a lot of you don't have that kind of warehouse staff. You might only have 1 or 2 people that are working in the warehouse, and they might be working jobs at the same time. So they might not have the time to spend an hour scanning out just cable. So that's why some people might set up cable as non-serialized, just so they could quickly type in this barcode, enter the quantity, and be done with it. But then more valuable items that they want to track a little bit closer, that you might not have huge quantities of, you would set those up as serialized. So again, it's up to you. I'm not going to say there's a right or wrong way to do it. Those are just some of the suggestions that I give to people when we're talking about how to set up your inventory. We're going to finish there today. We still have a few other things to look at, like how to set up suggestions, alternatives and substitutions, default suppliers for this inventory model, pricing, documents, etc., and the thresholds. We'll look at all that, I believe. I'm not sure if next week, but at least in a webinar in the next few weeks. And then, like I said, we'll also look at some of these other presets in a later webinar. We'll talk about what each of these different container and package items mean, and we'll look at virtual items as well. If you have any questions about setting up inventory, I always recommend going to our forum. It's just at forum.flexrentalsolutions.com, where we have thousands of active users. A lot of us here at Flex will scour the forum as well and answer questions, but a lot of times you might get answers from other Flex users who have maybe faced the same questions that you're asking. If you have more technical related issues, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.